Okay, I think we are good to go. So I am going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. My name is Roy Kammer, and I want to acknowledge this is our very first data analysis subcommittee meeting. So I want to say welcome to everyone and thank you for being here today. You might be asking, well, why is this camera guy leading this meeting? I have been asked to serve as the chair of this subcommittee. So thank you, Chair Geffen and Vice Chair Evans for doing that. I appreciate that and look forward to serving. If we have our newest member, Michelle, join today, I would like to do introductions when she gets here, but I think we'll go ahead and forego that right now, and we'll go ahead and keep moving forward. So let's talk a little bit just about data analysis and this being a subcommittee. Our goal with this subcommittee is really to get work done. So one of the things I think it's important just to be mindful of is we have 2 hours set aside for these meetings when we meet with hopes we'll be able to get some work done. And we understand not everyone will be able to stay all the time, every time, but we certainly want to be productive when we are meeting and work through data, analyze data, determine how we're going to present data, and so forth. So these will be very active, very engaging meetings. And I just encourage you all, whenever possible, to be in front of a screen where you can see spreadsheets and documents, because we're going to be getting work done. So with that, I see Michelle has joined us. Welcome, Michelle. Welcome.
Thank you.
What I'd love to do is go around and do introductions so we know who we have with us today. I'll go ahead and I'll start, and then we'll just pass it around the room. My name is Roy Kammer. I am a faculty member at Minnesota State University, Mankato. I am on the task force because I am an appointed member of the Minnesota Board of Behavioral Health and Therapy. So that's how I'm associated with the task force. And well, I have an interest in data. I like working with data and have enjoyed being a part of our data subcommittee, and am particularly excited to be a part of the data analysis subcommittee. So I'm just going to pass it around the screen here. Leo, you were next. Would you be willing to introduce yourself?
Yes, I am Leo Sandoval. I am a self-employed individual, and I am part of this committee because I am someone that has personal interest, as someone that has been affected by just some of the ways that things are structured. And so I personally have been impacted. And so even if I can help make a difference for someone else, that would mean the world. So that is why I am here. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo. John, you're next.
Thank you so much, Chair Kammer. I'm John Geffen. I am the director of the Reentry Clinic at Mitchell Hamlin School of Law. And I forget exactly how I got on this committee, but I've always been on this task force too. So, Michelle, I've seen your resume and seen your work before, and I'm really excited that you're joining us. Thank you.
I'm honored. Thank you.
Gina, you're next.
Hi, Michelle. Nice to
Hi.
see you.
You too.
Gina Evans. My day job is with Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge, and I also serve on the board with Minnesota Second Chance Coalition. I'm an impacted individual that has been impacted by the statutes that we're working on here. And I'm very excited to get to work looking at this data and doing the fact finding that will support the recommendations that we're making to the legislature. So thanks for being here.
Michelle, would you be willing to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm happy to be here. I'm Michelle Basham, and I'm the Deputy Director for Strategic Operations and Partnerships of VRS at DEED. That's a lot of acronyms. I'm also a part-time adjunct professor at Mitchell. Little biased, I love Mitchell. But over the years, I've done a variety of work related to racial equity, both in terms of working with groups and companies to train them on cultural inclusivity and racial equity work, but also looking at racial equity data in a variety of different contexts, including at one point, I was an attorney at DHS who issued the final decisions in contested case licensing appeals. And I did really, to be honest, at the time, see a lot of opportunity where, unfortunately, Chapter 245 and some of the disqualification work could have a disproportionate impact on marginalized and BIPOC communities. So that's part of why I'm part of this task force, as well as part of the data subcommittee, because I think data is a really powerful tool to inform decision making. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Mr. Vogel, could you identify who the other members of the committee are that we don't have with us? And then we can also introduce the other non-members who are here today as well.
Certainly, Mr. Chair. So I believe we're just missing Ms. Robertus. Jolene Robertus is with the Department of Corrections and also has served, as you know, on the other data subcommittee.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And would you be willing to do a quick introduction yourself, Mr. Vogel?
Certainly. Hi, everyone, and especially Ms. Basham. I'm Will Vogel. I'm with the Legislative Coordinating Commission, and I'm serving basically as the staff guy for the task force. So I'm here to provide administrative support for these sort of meetings, and also research support. So if you need something, just shoot me an email or otherwise get in touch.
Thank you. And then would any of our other attendees today be willing to introduce themselves and such? Thank you. Ms. Kassane, would you be willing to go?
Michelle, Member Basham. I'm Emily Kassane with Department of Human Services Background Study Division. I'm not on the task force or any of the subcommittees, but I do attend all the subcommittee meetings just to be a resource person, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has. And welcome to the group. Although I'm not on the group, I still will welcome you to the group.
Thank you. Thank you. And
I can say hi. I'm Carol Bisbee. I work for the LCC. I do administrative support. So Will is the main person and I'm his backup, and I get to say hi to everybody every meeting. So welcome.
wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for taking time to do those introductions. I would love to go ahead and jump into the next portion of our agenda, which is discussion on data analysis and thinking about the work that we want to accomplish. So just to frame where we have been and where we're at, we have received 4 data sets from DHS. We have spent some time analyzing data sets 1, 2, and 3. One of the questions we'll need to attend to is if we want to go back and do additional analysis with data sets 1, 2, and 3. And we also have data set 4, which we have not, we haven't really jumped into doing any real analysis yet. So that is my general thoughts on the data sets. My understanding is that today it sounds like we have a brief presentation on reconsideration requests that Mr. Vogel has put together. So that is one piece of data I shouldn't say one piece of data, but one element we should take a look at today, and then ultimately decide what we want to do with the rest of our time today and how we want to map out our time moving forward so that we're really productive in these meetings. So, so could I propose that we start out with the presentation that Mr. Vogel has put together? Is that a fair place to start today? Any objections? Hearing none. Mr. Vogel, would you be willing to share that document with us on screen and walk us through it? And we will ask what questions we have and see if there are other opportunities for data to be added.
Certainly, Mr. Chair. So this is just sort of a brief rundown of some analysis I've been doing of the addendum to the 4th DHS data set that we received, I think, a few weeks ago. So just by way of, I suppose, a refresher, that 4th DHS data set focuses essentially on the reconsideration process and outcomes that people who do seek reconsideration get. And the addendum was essentially supplementing that with information, breaking the reconsideration process down by the original crime or conduct that led to the disqualification in the first place. So that's what this presentation is going to be focusing on. So the data set, as you know, gave us information for 2018 and 2019. In 2018, and I should note that I'm focusing on the reconsideration process. There's the initial step before that, if a subject has been disqualified, where they can either choose to seek reconsideration or not. And we have statistics on that, and the majority of subjects don't seek reconsideration. However, of those who did in 2018, these were the outcomes of their reconsideration request. So the plurality were simply set aside. A little under a quarter were not set aside. And then we have these other categories that I know you, Mr. Chair, had asked about this, asked the department about this, what these categories mean. Going by the train of interpretation that you gave in the last data subcommittee meeting, which makes a lot of sense to me. I'd interpret, for example, remain set aside or previous set aside as being positive outcomes for an applicant, right? It means at the end of that they'll be able to work. Likewise, even not set aside variance granted, well, they're still getting a variance. They should still be able to work. So in that sense, not set aside, ignoring in process, not set aside, withdrawn, which is where the applicant withdraws their request for reconsideration, or correctness affirmed, which is for reconsideration requests that focus on the factual correctness of the determination rather than asking for a reconsideration while conceding the factual correctness. Those three I would interpret as the negative or adverse effects for the applicants. They can't work at the end of that. So that's a kind of a long-winded way of saying that we have about 22%, about 1.5%, and about 2%, roughly a quarter or so of 2018 reconsideration requests had an adverse outcome for the requestee. And it looks like about 75% had a positive outcome using, again, that terminology.
And Mr. Vogel, before you go on to the next slide, why don't we, I want to make sure we're going slow and being intentional here. I just want to open it up to the group to see if anyone has questions or comments regarding this slide. I'll share one that came to mind for me. I really like, I think we've heard feedback that our task force really likes these pie charts, which I think are great. One of the things going through my mind, and I'd appreciate feedback on this, is I'm wondering if there might be a way where we might try to do a little bit of color coding. And I say that hesitantly because I want to be mindful of accessibility as well. But I wonder if we could theme the colors and the placement of the adverse together, and then maybe theme the color and the placement of the positive outcome together, just so when other people who may not be familiar with the data are looking at it, go, oh, these are the adverse and these are the not adverse. So I'm just trying to think of the best way to display it for people who have those same questions we had last week, going, are these good, or are these not as good of outcomes? What are others' thoughts on that?
Yep, I concur with that, and I just want us to be mindful that not set aside variance and limited set aside, while folks are still able to work, it's not optimal either for the employee or the employer. And so I would even say that these outcomes would go into three categories if we're gonna block them out, right? So they would be positive, medium, and then negative. If we were gonna do that, if we were gonna group them together.
If I could piggyback on Gina's comment, I agree with that. And in addition, when there is a limited set aside or a variance granted, but of course it could have changed since I issued these decisions, and I'm sure that our colleague from DHS will let me know if I'm wrong, Emily, I think. But it's my understanding those are specific to one facility. So for example, if I was working at the bridge and they give me a variance at the bridge, that is only for the bridge. If I leave the bridge and go wherever else, I again have to go through that process.
And I think that's true for most set-asides as well.
Yeah.
That would be, I mean, there was this attempt at one point to have the traveling set aside, but my understanding is those numbers are really low.
Which brings us back to the question that we asked, what does previous set aside and remain set aside? What do those even mean, right? So we
Yeah.
are still waiting for some answers back from DHS, which we feel like will probably come a little quicker after session's over, right, Ms. Kassane?
Do you
Yes,
think-
Member Evans, and I will be getting that to you shortly.
All right.
It's on my list.
Do you think on this slide, Will, it could also just be some data about all of those individuals that do not request a set aside? Because those individuals through the process, whether it's a set aside or not, are not working. Those are negative outcomes to me in terms of people working. I find, in my opinion, the reconsideration request is somewhat daunting. And people with limited English proficiency, people who struggle with writing, people just even the what is the correctness request? What I mean, there are a host of reasons people don't request a set aside, and many of them, if they were able to do it successfully, would probably get a set aside.
John, I can't agree with you more. I can't tell you how many people call me, and Randy Anderson and I get so many calls about these, and they'll be like, it's for a fifth degree possession or something, where I'm just like, I can't understand why this wasn't set aside. It was long enough ago, and I'll dig down into it. And I've gotten into the habit now where my first question to folks where something seems fishy about it is, did you turn in your police reports? And 2 out of 3 times the answer is no. And so where people just aren't doing the process right. And so I want, the numbers about not set aside, how much of that is operator error, where the process is just so difficult. And sometimes it is folks that English isn't their first language. So.
And if I could add to that, I guess I'll just talk whenever Gina is done talking.
That's a good rule of thumb.
It's my understanding, again, from when I was issuing these, that many of the disqualification factors become a permanent bar if you fail to request reconsideration within the time required, regardless of what type of disqualification it is, which is also problematic. In addition to John's comments, if a person is unstably housed, as we know, people who are socioeconomically challenged tend to move more. They might not have gotten the paperwork, in addition to having some language barriers or possibly some physical ability barriers. But I just really question, I remember one case, and I'll try not to do this, but it was a license holder's long-term romantic partner had bounced some checks, and because of that, and not appealing it within the required time period, because why would he? He wasn't, he wasn't operating a child care center or foster care, et cetera. And so it became a permanent bar. And to me, for somebody operating an in-home child care center, and now they're losing their license and he's getting a permanent bar for bouncing checks, to me, oftentimes that's a poverty crime.
I'm so glad you're here, Michelle. I'm so glad you're here. I forgot about that. And I don't know that that's something that we have talked about in here or in the permanent bar. I forgot about that. If you don't appeal in time on some of the charges, it goes to permanent. Is anybody that is in here with me in remedies? Well, I'm going to write it down, but help me remember to talk about that in the remedies subcommittee, because I don't think we've talked about that.
Certainly, Ms. Evans.
I forgot about that.
Any other comments on this slide? Hearing none. Mr. Vogel, you want to carry on to the next?
Certainly, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Chair, members, for this feedback. I'll definitely incorporate it and produce some better versions of this slide or these slides.
And I want to emphasize it's fantastic. It's fantastic.
Oh, certainly.
These are all things to just keep us, moving ahead. So thank you.
Definitely, but yeah, it's very constructive feedback. So, Mr. Chair, actually, I guess I'll present you and the members with a choice. So I've done these slides for 2018 and 2019. So I'm essentially doing 2018 running through various styles of slide and then 2019 through various styles of slide. Would you prefer to go thematically like that or chronologically? No. Would you prefer to go chronologically or thematically? Would you like to see the equivalent slide to 2019, or should I move on to the next 2018 slide?
I'd say I prefer thematically, so we can see what 2018 looks like and what 2019 looks like. That's
Certainly
better in my brain. So everyone else good with that?
So all the way through 18 and then all the way through 19?
I think we're going to look
at forth.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Chair. I interpreted you as saying skipping back and forth, essentially.
Yeah, I would skip back and forth. So we'd look at the 2018 data, and then we'd look at the exact same 2019 data, just so I can see here. So
in that case, Mr. Chair, members, this is the 2018 data. Here's the same breakdown for 2019. So the primary change that stands out to me is a uptick in not set aside and a downtick, if that's a word, in previous set aside and remain set aside categories. I don't know if I can offer an interpretation. I just noticed that when I first looked at this. Again, for reference, here's 2018, 22.5% not set aside, hovering around 10% each, plus or minus for previous and remain set aside. And in 2019, we're up to almost 30% for not set aside and hovering around like 5% each for remains and previous. The absolute number of reconsideration requests increased in that year. I should note also that's probably reflective of upstream numbers. The absolute number of disqualifications increased between 2018 and 2019, as we've discussed. But yeah, that's essentially that breakdown for 2019.
And I had thought at one point it had been identified that between 2018 and 2019, one of the big changes was the department at the state level was doing some of the previous data set asides that the county was doing. So that was part of that big uptick too, right?
I believe so, Mr. Geffen.
I was going to ask Mr. Vogel, this might be in a subsequent slide, but are we going to lay race and ethnicity data on top of this and see, like, for the set aside, not set aside, how it breaks if we disaggregate it based on race and ethnicity? I'm very curious what it looks like.
So Ms. Basham, the very short answer is no, not in this presentation, but the longer answer is we do have that disaggregated data. For example, an equivalent breakdown to the breakdown of outcomes by crime or conduct that I'm using here, we already had in the form of a breakdown of outcomes by race. And I've actually done several of these things, breaking down other parts of the data sets by race. I'll just send you all of those after this meeting, if that's okay with you, just so you can see what I've done.
Absolutely.
We have lots of desegregated data by race, but sometimes they won't give us data that's less than 10 because of
data privacy concerns.
So you can't identify folks. And so there's some stuff, if we break it down by all the way down and all the way down, it just is a sea of less than 10s. And this is one of those areas that we couldn't break it down by, when we get down into this, by reconsideration, by crime, by race. So we have some race data in this section, but not by crime and by race, which is really sad because it would have been nice to see by crime and by race, but we don't have it.
Yeah, and thank you, Ms. Evans. Mr. Chair, I'm going to move on then.
Absolutely, thank you.
All right, so skipping back to 2018, one thing I then did with this data was essentially ranked the crimes or conduct that prompted the initial disqualification in order of how many of them there were. So this is just using 10 as a magic number. This is the top 10 disqualifying crimes or conduct that then ended up in this reconsideration process. And so we see theft, for example, leading here. I should note, by the way, that some of the other data sets we've received break down crime or conduct by look back period, the 15, 10, and 7 year, for example. This data, or these data, unfortunately, for that purpose, just sort of throw everything in one pot. So I doubt there are very many of them, but even permanent disqualifications are in here, which, obviously wouldn't even be eligible for set aside determination. So we see theft, domestic assault, etc. I guess I won't read the whole list. I'll also point out I have these statistics here for percentage set aside and percentage in the not set aside categories. These are imperfect metrics. Just, I suppose, jumping away from this for a second. Sorry if this interrupts your train of thought. But again, those are just these two categories here. These other categories could represent positive or medium or negative outcomes for the applicant, as we've just discussed. But because of this issue of single digit numbers being reported as less than 10 in these data sets, I just can't calculate a precise percentage for some of the smaller numbers. And in fact, I can't calculate a precise percentage for percentage not set aside for felony driving while impaired because it's reported as less than 10. So if you see gaps in this, that's essentially where that's coming from. But yeah, just settling down, letting you digest this.
Any questions, any comments from?
I have a very silly comment or question about the driving while impaired.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, never mind. I was going to say, couldn't we just do the math and figure out what the percentage is if they give us 60%? But never mind, there are all those other criteria. So
exactly, yeah.
I'm sure
occasionally, yeah.
Greenness on numbers. All right, sorry.
Yep, no worries.
I'm going to ask us to put on our hats of people who haven't worked with these data very often. It's clicking for me. I just ask us to go, is this going to make sense for other members of the task force? Is there anything we can do to make it more clear and comprehensible for others? I think it's good, but I want to be mindful of that.
Yeah, he put together a pie chart of this, so it'll clear up then. I would just like to point out also that, like, other than maybe one of these, it's all substance use crimes and crimes of poverty. So
Well said, Gina. Okay.
All right, so equivalent slide for 2019. So again, led by theft, fifth degree controlled substance crime is prominent, domestic assault is prominent. Yeah. And again, these percentages go around, but as a general rule with these top 10 crimes, we see a lot higher portion of them set aside than not set aside.
I have a question on the controlled substance. So you have controlled substance in the fifth, controlled substance in the third, controlled substance in the first. The set aside numbers are lowest for fifth degree?
That's how it looks to me, Mr. Geffen, and that confused me. Thank you for reminding me of that.
And I mean, and not just marginally, there's a 20% difference between set asides of fifth degree and third degree. That kind of blows my mind.
I mean, here are the absolute numbers that these percentages are calculated from. Here's where I'm on the limit of my statistical knowledge, but I think these are all large enough numbers that we're not seeing an artifact of very small absolute numbers. But
it was true with the 2018 data too.
Yeah, I'll move back to that for a second, actually. So here's fifth degree, 58% set aside. First degree, 62% set aside.
I guess it's not as significant, but I don't know. I just thought that was really weird.
That's the wrong slide. There we go.
In 2018, how many issuance of dishonored check were not set aside?
None.
So for 2 years, they set aside every single issuance of dishonored check.
Or there were any of those other outcomes.
So write that down, Will, because
Yeah.
that, I feel like that it's a crime of poverty. It's people writing their own checks, right? That's what that is.
Mhm. I
Yeah,
believe so.
And
Yeah,
so,
I guess it's not a forged check.
Yep. And so let's get rid of it, right? Let's take it off there altogether. If they're setting every single one aside, like what's the point? I feel like that's a great, like, finding of fact and something
Yeah.
great to put.
This data will work really well, Gina, with the disqualification subcommittee's analysis of which cases, of which disqualifying factors we recommend removing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. This is really helpful. Going back to what you said, Chair Camera, this is really, really helpful, even for a non-numbers mind like mine.
Back to 2019, again, no reconsideration applications for issuance of dishonored checks were like simply not set aside. I'd have to go back and look at the data to see if any were withdrawn or just a finding of fact was made.
And how do we know if these are felonies, gross misdemeanors, or misdemeanors? We don't. They're all junk together, right?
As I understand it, Ms. Evans, yeah.
I mean, some of them you can figure out by just looking at the statute, but a lot of these you can't. You know, I mean, just based on like the level of assault, but
yeah,
but
like
right.
Issuance of a dishonored check is in all three.
Yep.
It depends on the amount. And so
exactly.
Yeah, same thing with wrongfully obtaining assistance. It's under all three.
So I have a comment about a different area, which the data trends in a different direction, looking at controlled substance in the 5th degree. It's a pretty high number that were not set aside. The reconsideration factors, as you guys might be aware, are recency, chronicity, severity, and relatedness.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, when I think through the lens of like working with a vulnerable population, be that kids or vulnerable adults, what is the rational relationship between controlled substance in the 5th, which to me is very often code for being BIPOC in a low-income neighborhood, and working with kids or vulnerable adults? There's none.
Yeah. Yeah. What is the risk of harm? I've been talking about that for 8 months.
Exactly. So I would encourage us to consider making some recommendations really with regard to that as well, particularly given the enforcement and sentencing patterns related to controlled substances and the significant racial disparities that exist there.
Is there any way we want to highlight some of these key points on these slides by bolding or coloration of numbers, like if we've got a 100, or like a 0 or anything like that? Or do we just want to make notes like, I mean, I find it so helpful that we're sitting and going through it together. I'm also thinking when others might look at these or when we might present them, how do we draw others to some of these same ideas, same facts that we're identifying and simplify it for them?
You want to know the other thing? Yes, we should color code it in some way. I just want to say one other thing that is just driving me crazy right now. Like, you look at controlled substance crimes, 5th degree, for instance, which is, it's low level, right? They got caught basically with, I don't know what the statute is, but it's personal, right? It's a little tiny bit of drugs. My 3/5 degrees all together was like 0.2 of a gram, like it was nothing. And like 35% of them are not getting set aside. Look at the difference between felony driving while impaired, which is more a white crime than it is a black and brown bodied crime. And like that is aggravating to me, the differences in, and how that gets set aside compared to how drug crimes get set aside. And a lot of the 5th degree, a lot of that, depending, I don't know how the years are for 18 and 19. I got to keep remembering what we're looking at, but going back a little further than that, how much of that is marijuana crimes?
The other thing to remember too, Gina, is that just regular DWI, the misdemeanor, gross misdemeanor, they're not disqualifying.
Yep. And so, I'll get down off my soapbox now. The other thing too is like assault in the 5th degree, like how that stuff gets charged out or not charged. So.
Yeah, here's a good lawyer joke. What's the difference between a 5th degree assault and a disorderly conduct? A good lawyer. I mean, they're the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, if you read them, there's no difference.
Yep. So,
is there a way to add like a bubble where you can just make little comments on the actual slide? Like, is there a feature with PowerPoint that would just help save that, instead of color coding? Because that can just generally be, I don't know, not looked at closely enough.
Yeah, my struggle here, and Mr. Vogel, you've worked with a lot of this, I think, on these slides, is how do we do it in a way that is going to be visually accessible as well too, keeping in mind that I know that colors are not always the best means, but it's something I'm trying to be more thoughtful of, is how do we make it prominent and understandable and yet accessible for any individual who might be reading it.
So there's a box on the bottom that says click to add notes. We could add notes down there. We could also do another slide after the slide and refer to the statute number and add our comments maybe. Otherwise, what you got, Will?
Thanks for the feedback, everyone. And Chair Kammer is correct about the accessibility issues. So like adding that other slide, for example, as you suggest, Ms. Evans, might be the most expedient to sort of meet both goals. But thank you for your suggestions, everyone, and I'll look to incorporate something that meets accessibility and still highlights the points you've made. I'm going to skip back to 2018 then. So again, skipping back to this list of top 10 crimes, I then essentially categorize these crimes using the categories the data subcommittee's been working with of people, property, substance-related crimes, and then maltreatment determinations, and essentially broke down how many were in each category of these top 10, I should say. So of these top 10, the plurality were property crimes. I mean, that's essentially because theft far and away leads all the rest of these. And then we see 23% people, 29% substance related, and 6% maltreatment determinations in that top 10. Again, not for all recon requests in that year. And please cut me off if you have any observations or questions.
Well, I had one question. Yep. Do you have a slide for the top 10? When we found that dishonored check at 0, do you have a slide for the top 10 set asides? Like with that 0 or just thinking of weaponizing that data to show that there are some that are always getting set aside.
Essentially, Mr. Geffen, it'd be this slide that I just moved to, actually.
Got burglary?
Yeah,
Is it
I mean,
zero?
there were only 58 recon requests for burglary in 2018, so I don't know if that's affecting this, but yeah, no not set asides for burglary in 2018.
But on this one, there's not, you don't have it listed, the issuance of a dishonored check.
No, Mr. Chair, or sorry, Mr. Geffen. So in the case of force of habit, so in the case of this slide, I'm skipping ahead of myself a little bit, but this is ranking the top 10 by percentage set aside.
Got it. Understood.
And then
Sorry.
the next slide, no worries. The next slide is listing the top 10 by largest percentage of not set aside. And just spoiler alert, it's a lot of maltreatment. But I didn't actually do a ranking of least percentage of set asides. I can definitely look into doing that, however. Just a moment, I'm making a note to myself. So I'm just going to jump from this to 2019 to the equivalent slide for 2019, where we see, I mean, like squinting at it, pretty much the same category breakdown. There's a variation of a few percentage points, but I don't know if I noticed anything significant about that, about the difference between the 2 years.
My only suggestion for these, Mr. Vogel, is since these are definitions that we essentially created or categories we created,
yeah.
I think it would be helpful to give some sort of little bit more definition on the slide, just if it's not apparent to others, you know, what we mean by people, maltreatment, property, and substance. But again, we know, I'm just trying to think for the other readers a little bit more clarity.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
And in fact, as a little bit of self-feedback, I was realizing as I went through this that I should have tried to incorporate some sort of color coding into this slide to break it down by these categories, because I did that in the spreadsheet. I just didn't do that in this slide. Although again, you know, you're sort of doing a balancing act with accessibility considerations. But thank you. So I'm going to move back to 2018. This is taking this chart essentially and breaking it down slightly by outcome. And I want to emphasize slightly because just jumping to 2019, I think this is, while extremely complex looking, a much more useful version of this 2018 slide I'm showing. So this 2018 slide is taking, here I am using color coding of different shades. It's taking this slide with, say, the 42% property and breaking the 42% property related crimes into those that are in the set aside or were reported in the set aside category and all others. So we can see that like the low 40% of people in property crimes in 2018 were in the set aside category. About 59% of substance related crimes, and then about 25% of maltreatment determinations of recon requests for a DQ based on a recon, based on a maltreatment determination. Now, the reason I say that I'd argue this 2018 slide is not as useful as the 2019 one is with the 2018 one, again, due to the imprecision of the sub 10 data, I couldn't calculate for these top 10 the percentage that were not set aside. And again, I'm just going to skip to 2019. Sorry, let me know if you're not following. But given how there are all these outcomes and we're interpreting, for example, remain set aside and previous set aside as probably pretty positive for somebody who's making one of these requests. It's not really fair to say that, you know, this 50 some percent, that this higher percentage of other property than property set aside represents negative outcomes for people who are applying for reconsideration from a property crime based DQ, if you follow. Like a lot of these are still probably positive outcomes for the individual involved. And if you're following that, we can see that reflected in the 2019 data where those top 10 had double digits reported for not set aside, the not set aside category, which allowed me to calculate it. So this is more visually busy. I do acknowledge that. But for example, here's about 47%, 1,344 of this top 10 were in the property category that we're using. And if you break that down, then we see 680 were in the set aside category and 398 were in the not set aside category, leaving 266. But I think it's probably a fair interpretation to say that a large number of those, again, were what we call a positive outcome for the applicant, like a set aside. I'm going to shut up now because that's my long train of thought. Does that make sense to members?
It does. And one of the things going through my mind, Mr. Vogel, is I like pie charts, but I'm wondering if for this, are you familiar with stacked bar charts?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I haven't used them much, but
yeah, I'm just wondering if a stacked bar, not a lawyer joke, but a stacked bar chart, but if a stacked bar chart might be a more effective display than the pie chart here, because it's going to, we could take each of those, essentially 4 items and have a stacked bar of set aside, not set aside, and other. It still gives you the ability to kind of compare from variable to variable. So I don't know. I like stacked bar charts, but my experience is that either people love them or hate them. So I'm just trying to think if there's a way to make it more simple for the reader. Anyone else familiar with stacked bar charts, and if that might be a more effective way to lay out the data?
Yeah, especially because then we'd be able to see like the total at the top of it, like out of how many. I think that would be a great idea. Then you wouldn't have to flip back and forth between two different charts. I think we could do some work on that for sure.
Definitely, Mr. Chair. I can see about a stacked bar chart and play around with other visualizations to see if anything particularly stands out.
I'm with you. It's good. My fear is that it just gets a little busy, I think. So I'm just trying to think of a way that would break it down just a bit more.
Yeah, I appreciate the feedback. You don't need to spare my feelings. This chart's kind of a mess.
I agree. It's a little busy too. I think I agree. But and part of it is, well, the information's so important.
Yeah.
The thing that is really striking me too is about this maltreatment stuff. And maybe this is a little bit of I didn't understand how low the percentage of set-asides are for maltreatment, because maltreatment is one of the few things in the disqualification statute that's not a crime. So this is civil maltreatment decided by the preponderance of the evidence, which in my experience means no charges were ever filed for malicious punishment of a child. Yet you're seeing incredibly low, even though it's a quote unquote conviction of a civil case. That's really surprising to me and disconcerting.
Yeah, I suppose to somewhat echo Mr. Geffen's comment, that was the main insight that stood out to me looking at these data. We see roughly the same rate of not set aside for substance, property, and people-related crimes, but substantially higher rates of not set aside for maltreatment.
And I'm thinking that's where whoever said it before, like if we use the note sections, whether we do it now or Mr. Vogel, if you want to do it later, I think is we identify some of these salient points from the data. I think we want to capture them somewhere. So when we look at these again, we aren't rehashing what we've already discovered or rediscovering what we've already discovered, just to keep note of what we think some of the key points are. Oh, cool. Okay, are you ready to move on, Mr. Vogel?
Yes, Mr. Chair,
okay,
and I am also keeping these points in my notes. So
I imagined you probably were. So
yep.
Thank you.
So moving back to 2018, then you got your spoiler thanks to Mr. Geffen. But these are I know, right? But these are ranking not this list of top 10 crimes, but rather taking all of the crimes or conduct and ranking them by the percentage set aside. So again, almost 71% of reconsideration requests where the DQ was for burglary were set aside in 2018. None were not set aside. And we see this number go down, but remaining above 50% for this top 10. And I'll note again, we see some unknown percentages for percentage not set aside because we have this sub 10 reported. Equivalent chart for 2019. Here we do see the 0 for not set aside for issuance of dishonored checks. In this case, because it was the second most. If you requested reconsideration in that year, it was the second crime that you could have gotten DQ'd for. You'd be second most likely to get a set aside from, if that makes sense. And then essentially the same logic, but applied, we're back in 2018, to percentage not set aside. So this, again, gets back to Mr. Geffen's point about maltreatment determinations. This chart, as a general rule, has a lot of maltreatment on it. In fact, there's a substantial gap between your close to 65% chance of not having a recurring maltreatment of a vulnerable adult set aside, with the next highest, which would be your 36% chance of domestic abuse act not being set aside. And I'm using chance a little fast and dirty there, but apologies.
So, Mr. Vogel, these are incredibly helpful. Thank you so much for all your work on this. It's evident you put a lot of work into this. It's interesting to me. I would not necessarily argue, particularly with high-risk populations, not setting aside a recurring maltreatment determination, for example. However, we also, I just want to say again, point out, really high there is assault in the fifth, controlled substance, and financial transactions card fraud, which again is ripe for racial disparities, racial bias, and poverty-related crimes.
Well, so there are two types of maltreatment that are listed here, both the maltreatment to minor and the vulnerable adult maltreatment, which are different statutes. And it lists as recurring. There are two types of maltreatment that disqualify an individual. It can be recurring or serious. When they say recurring, this is just recurring. These are not the serious maltreatment cases.
Mr. Geff?
Yeah.
Mr. Geffen, I believe so. One quick way for me to check that after I've finished this presentation would be to look at essentially the data set and see if I can see serious in there as well, reported as a separate crime.
That's what I was going to. I find it sometimes they write recurring or serious or recurring, and they sort of group them together. I was just wondering if we could figure that out, because the recurring would be 2 incidences of non-serious maltreatment, 2 or more, as opposed to 1 incident of serious. So I think we just want to figure that out.
I'll definitely look into that, Mr. Geffen. And I should note that all the terminology I'm using here is just reporting verbatim what's reported in the DHS data set. So it's what their system spit out, typos and all.
And can I just go a step further? And we probably don't have data that will show us this, but maltreatment could be not satisfying, for example, the requirement that you be within sight and hearing, particularly with kids in a childcare setting. Or maltreatment could be one of the worst cases I read where God told her to put the baby in boiling water. So she put the baby in boiling water. But to me, those are 2 very different things. And we don't necessarily know how that breaks down, which is not, of course, criticism of you, Mr. Vogel. We probably don't have that information, but.
And that could be something to go back to data subcommittee, say, of the disqualifying, are you finding on based on neglect, physical abuse, financial exploitation, or I think sexual abuse are the 4 categories. I think Ms. Basham's 100% right. It'd be nice to know that, even if they don't have the set aside, because I think there is a difference between the neglect where you turn around and, there's just a lot of differences.
Thank you for those observations. And then I think I just have one slide left, actually, which is the equivalent slide for 2019. So again, recurring maltreatment of a vulnerable adult dominates this. I'll note we see maltreatment generally jump up in prominence in 2019. I'm not quite sure what's going on with that, but it brings the percentage not set aside up a bit.
Thank you. I just general feedback inquiry from the group. Was it helpful to look at these by topic rather than go through the whole year topic by topic first and then the second year topic by topic? And if so, I'm wondering if we want to reorder the slides, Mr. Vogel, to pull the 2018 and then the 2019 equivalent, side by side, and so on and so forth, because I think it's probably, I like comparing year to year. That's intriguing to me, and I think it might make more sense for the typical consumer. But I'd be curious to see what other subcommittee members think about that.
It would be great to have the side by side comparisons on one slide. To have.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, Ms. Evans, I can definitely look into trying to do that as much as possible. I've defaulted to one year per slide often because that gets a slide very visually jumbled and a little more difficult to remediate for accessibility. But thank you for that feedback. That is a fair point.
Yep. Sometimes the charts that are next to the slides are less helpful than the slide. The charts that are next to the graphs are less helpful than the graph itself. And so, or that the graph could be on a different slide than, I mean, the chart, the numbers, the big blocks of information could be on a separate one. And
gotcha. Again, this monstrosity.
Yep. So that graph right there is less helpful than, the box is less helpful than the graph itself. And so to have the graphs be, next to each other, 2018, 2019, this one here could be a bar chart for sure, but go up to slide 10. Like for sure, you could get this one next to each other, like we did with the DOC data and the total disqualification data. So would be good on the ones we can, Yep,
that's a fair point. Thank you, Ms. Evans.
You're doing great. Well, you're doing great.
I appreciate that.
Okay, any other comments on this presentation that Mr. Vogel has put together for us?
Thank you, Will.
Thank you, members, for your feedback.
Are you related to Howard Vogel?
I don't believe so, Ms. Basham. I'm actually from Western Ohio originally, so probably no Minnesota Vogels. It's a common enough German name.
Okay, had to ask. Thank you.
Okay, well, I did notice Ms. Robertus, I believe, joined us, and you didn't get to do introductions with us. So I was wondering, would you be willing to introduce yourself? And then Ms. Basham, would you be willing to introduce yourself just so everybody knows everybody on the subcommittee?
For sure. Hi, I'm Jolene Robertus. I actually work for the Minnesota Department of Corrections. Happy to be here. I feel like some of your brain power might exceed mine, but we'll try to be as helpful as possible as we move through this. I was a part of the data. I don't even know what our committee was called, the data subcommittee previously, and so we're shifting to here. This was excellent. Nice to meet you, Michelle.
You too, Jolene. I'm Michelle Basham. I'm the Deputy Director for Operations and Partnerships for VRS, Vocational and Rehabilitation Services within DEED. I've also led various nonprofits and am an adjunct professor, and at one point issued the final decisions on behalf of the Commissioner DHS in contested case licensing appeals.
And Mr. Chair, I actually have an answer to Mr. Geffen's question. I'll just share my screen briefly. So it looks like recurring maltreatment is reported as a separate category from serious and recurring and serious maltreatment in this data, or these data. And here I'm just referring to this supplement to DHS dataset through F4. That's all.
Wonderful. Well, since we have time left, I would love to make a proposal since we've gotten to start taking a look at data set 4. I am wondering if there would be merit in pulling up data set 4 and going through it. And I like to do things slide by slide together and just go, what if, or I wonder, or it would be helpful if. Would that be a fair next step, is to pull up that data set 4? Okay. And Ms. Basham, I think this will get back to what you're saying. Can we do something with race and ethnicity, and we can see what we have here and what we might be able to do? So so let's go ahead and let's go through slide by slide, sheet by sheet, page by page, and talk about where we might want to go with data set 4.
All right, just let me know when I should advance, Mr. Chair.
Okay. So this just basically gives the overview. So I don't think there's necessarily anything we need to do with this here, other than I just encourage everyone, if you haven't already, to make sure you read these. These are helpful. So when we get to the questions, people go, how is this defined? Sometimes we have the definitions and explanations here, and it's just DHS does a great job giving us overviews here. So okay, let's go on to the next page. Okay. I think some sort of graphic would be helpful here. And I am pondering, and maybe we all take a moment here and think, what would be most useful here? Because we've got a lot of data here on one slide. What would we visually want to see here? I'm wondering if visually we want to, for each year, break out, because I think what we're getting at is who requests and who doesn't request consideration. And I'm wondering for 2018, we have, a gender breakdown of who requests yes, no, for 18 and 19. And then I think we do separately the race, ethnicity, yes versus no, into something more visual. What do others think? What would you be interested in seeing?
So would this be a pie chart?
Yeah.
With the races and then reconsidered, not reconsidered? Do we do it separate, male and female, and then race?
Yeah, I think
pie charts?
I agree. I think we do it pie charts for male and female first for 2018 and 2019, probably side by side. And then I could picture pie charts 2018, 2019 by race, the race ethnicity data. Does that make sense?
I'm taking notes. No. So we have this.
I'm backtracking here because it's easier with male, female because we only have 2 categories. I'm pondering for a moment what this would look like. I sometimes have to draw it out first.
I I feel like the pie chart's going to be the most glaring.
Yeah.
Pardon me.
I'm wondering if this is a spot, since we have multiple variables here again, where a stacked bar might be more efficient of a display.
Yep, because this is the spot where I was talking about, Michelle, that we don't have it by crime, which I feel like is what we really want. And once you get into the actual breakdown of crime and conduct, it would just be a C of less than 10s. So
I'm also curious, but I suspect that's on one of the subsequent slides, but how the reconsideration requested or are granted or not granted breaks down by race and ethnicity.
Just to anticipate that would actually be table 2 here, Ms. Bastian. Ms. Basham.
I think this, and this is some inference here, right? But this slide is important to me because it speaks to how women tend to likely go into these types of professions more frequently. And even though they have lower crime rates, they're significantly more impacted in the long term. So if you look at this, women are typically higher in all of these categories, especially in the African-American community. And so I just think it may highlight just the gender disparities that exist. I don't know if it's because women choose this profession more or these types of professions more, but that could be one explanation. But
well, and I'm just going to keep bringing it up, but right now at Shakopee, and I can bring up today's data, but a couple weeks ago, 66% of the women at Shakopee right now are there for drug possession, drug sales, and DWIs. And that's current data. And then when you look at overall at the DOC, Warren Lemmer's calling me right now. I got to take this.
I just wrote down and added some numbers for 2019. And potentially if we did another chart or like a pie chart to roll things up. So just comparing white Caucasian individuals to non-Caucasian individuals. So I grouped together all of the minority groups. So for 2019, 2,312 Caucasian individuals requested reconsideration, 1,491 non-Caucasian individuals, and did not request reconsideration was 3,527 Caucasians versus compared to 4,296 non-Caucasian individuals. So I think one of the things I find really interesting there is an obvious disparity jumps out, because as a percentage of the population, people of color don't add up to don't represent that kind of percentage.
Yeah, I like that. A lot of the breakdowns we've done before, we've broken down into all the specific categories. What I liked about that is having, white, Caucasian / not, non, and I think that could be more powerful, more dramatic in a display. So I really like that.
One question for my own information. You're omitting none provided and unknown other.
Yes,
okay.
I was just going to clarify that. So the numbers I just reported do not include none or unknown.
Would the members be comfortable if I basically ditch those two categories for the purposes of combining white versus non-white racial groups?
Yeah, I think so. I think we just want to make sure we, in the notes or somewhere, note what we're doing, just so in case anyone asks or we go back later, we clearly remember,
I mean, if you ditch them, that's fine, but you're still seeing that females are in some of those categories 3 times higher rate of numbers.
Yeah.
So I just think it's worth considering.
Ms. Robertus, do you, in the data displays here, would you want to look at gender by race, or would it be more powerful to look specifically at gender as a whole?
I think by race would be impactful, right? Because even here, when you're looking at this, you are seeing some impactful numbers, I think, in the Native American and African American communities for sure. I know when we were in that other, in our other group for Chair Williamson, this was a point of information. I think she wanted to highlight too, that there are some gender disparities in what impacts women and families a bit higher than men. So
Yeah.
Just a thought.
Absolutely.
But I think by race is important. I think as everyone's highlighted, there are disparities certainly for these women that white women don't have.
And I suppose, Mr. Chair, if you don't mind me jumping in here for a second, just to reinforce the point Mr. Burtis was making, I think I've sent out a version of, well, I've sent out this information transferred to spreadsheets so y'all can play with it. I think I've sent out a version where I did like basic percentage calculations. So for example, based on this data here, with this, about 15% of African-American women in 2019 requested reconsideration. Sorry. Just a moment, Mr. Chair. Sorry, I thought I had a point to make, and then I realized I didn't know what percentages I was using. Yeah, sorry. Could you all just ignore what the point I just made? I'll try to figure out what I was saying.
So I think to get what we want here, we're looking at a few different displays. So I think what we're proposing, Mr. Vogel, is, and Mr. Vogel, let us know if these are things you are able to help create, or if you need us as members to help with this too, and we certainly can. I think we're looking at some displays of basically white and then non-white, and I don't like using that, framing it that way, but ultimately, people of color, people who don't identify as white, looking at reconsideration, if they are or are not requesting consideration, looking at the differences there. I think we also ultimately want to look at by race, ethnicity, as breaking it down more specifically. If they are, so it might help just for progression wise to do a pie chart of breaking down each of those categories, and then doing a more composite where we group up African American, Asian, Pacific Islander, Native American into a category and compare it to white, just to kind of do the add up there. I'm thinking out loud, so we might have to rewind my thoughts as well too. And
Mr. Chair, in answer to sort of your implicit earlier question, I can definitely do work on a lot of these data visualization lines. I think that would be an appropriate offline conversation to have with, say, the other subcommittee chairs, just because it's a question of prioritizing my time.
Yeah, makes sense.
Happy to do it, but it's a question of what you want out of me.
Perfect. Makes sense. So, and then we of course want to have some tables, just to make sure we reflect, I should say tables, but displays reflecting gender, and then gender overlaid on with race. So we've got potentially four different displays that we're looking at based on this table alone. Any other pieces as we take a look at this that we want to get on the books for things we want to look at digging into?
So I think we could also look at percentages for the numbers I just reported for, again, 2019. For white, requested reconsideration was 61%. Non-white requested reconsideration was 39%. For did not request reconsideration, white was 45% and non-white was 55%, which I think is also interesting.
I agree.
And I'm still like really, really interested of like how the granted or not granted breaks down, which I think is going to be one of the next slides, so I can stop squirming soon.
Well, sounds good.
And
Why
Mr.
don't we
Chair,
go? Oh, go ahead, Will.
just by way of explaining what I was on about earlier, I sort of reconstructed my thought process. So this cell here represents about 16% of African-American individuals in 2019 in total. The female requested reconsideration. And the point I was badly trying to make is this slide here represents 29% of white individuals in that same year. So it's not, I thought it was more apples to apples than it actually is, but it seems like more white women were requesting reconsideration than African-American women. But I don't know if that's actually a good point to make. Just wanted to explain what I was saying earlier.
And my guess would be more white women had their request granted.
Well, I guess we could see that in the next table, Ms. Basham. I don't actually recall off the top of my head. Mr. Chair, would you like me to move on, or? All right, so yeah, some more of this introductory stuff, which is very valuable to read. And I'm just gonna, yeah. So here are these definitions, by the way. I know there was some discussion of previous set aside and remain set aside. I suppose I just to editorialize from how I interpret these, it almost seems like you could identify a previous set aside or remain set aside determination as a duplication of effort, but I'm not sure if that's a fair interpretation. And then finally, here we are at table 2.
And I think this is where Ms. Evans was saying we run into some of the issues. Ms. Basham, we have a lot of less than 10s. So, you know, getting down to that granular level presents a problem. We've got good data here, but I think we've got to decide what would be the most useful way to display it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
At least to me. I can't speak for anyone else.
Because like I'd love to look, you know, at percents all the way across for these, but when we have the less than 10s, we run into a little bit of an issue there. I mean, we can make some assumptions here in places, but it gets a little bit more complex. I wonder though, this might be a good spot. No, I don't know that we could do it. I was gonna say if we had, there's always enough in the white category. I was gonna say if we had known values and none provided and unknown or other, we could remove those, but we don't. We've got less than 10s there. But if we did, we could remove those and do the same thing we did prior and just have white, you know, white category and then a compiled Native American, Asian, Pacific Islander, and African American. But I don't think we have quite enough to do that either.
Mr. Chair, yeah, this seems like one of those logic puzzles where you may or may not have exactly the right amount of information. I can,
right.
Having these grand totals, I can just try to see if we can. I don't think that would work though.
Yeah,
I'm generally uncomfortable with like trying to backwards derive a number that's not reported. Yeah. But
and we shouldn't.
I think
we
that
shouldn't.
would be, yeah, but I think that would be appropriate if we could.
Any thoughts from others on how we might display these?
In a pie chart, and I would do the set aside, not set aside.
Yep.
If it's, well, if it's on a pie chart and it's instead a grid like this, I would do the set aside, not a set aside first. And then drop everything else down, because those are the two biggest, most significant determinations. I'm adding up percentages right now.
Yep. And the other thing I feel like with this one, like we have the grand total overall, but I feel like it would be, oh, we do have the total for 2018 and 2019 separate. Yeah, because it's just a lot. So I agree with Michelle. We're going to need set aside and not set as to just do those two things. And then how do we compare? How do we compare it in a way that makes sense? This, when you get too much data, I feel like it gets tough.
So I think the numbers tell a story when broken down that way. So I just looked at the 2019 numbers.
Yeah.
And reconsideration set aside for white is 1,179, equal to 67% of the total. Non-white, which again is combining African American, Asian or Pacific Islander or Native American only, not including the none or the unknown, is 33% of the reconsideration granted. So again, a disproportionality, it's almost an inverse of requested versus granted. And then reconsideration not granted for whites is 54%, for non-whites, it's 46%. That one seems a little bit less stark than the reconsideration granted at 67 versus 33%. And again, I was taking only 2019 and the set aside and not set aside.
Ms. Basham, Mr. Chair, I realize I'm not a member, but sort of acting like one. So with your permission, for my information, could you repeat the first calculation you made, Ms. Basham, just so I understand it?
So I was looking only at 2019, just
Okay.
because I don't have enough time here to do all of it.
Mm-hmm.
But for 2019, I looked at the set aside and not set aside. So it's set aside, which is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's the 6th row. And not set aside, which is second from the bottom. And comparing white to non-white, non-white meaning a combination of African American, Asian or Pacific Islander, and Native American.
Mm-hmm.
I did not include in what I'm reporting the none or the unknown, because I don't think we can. We don't know, so because we don't know where to put them, so we have to throw those out, in my opinion, from a statistical reliability perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at those in 2019, reconsideration granted for whites was equal to 67% of the total.
Of the total reconsideration granted in that year.
Correct.
Okay.
I'm sorry, reconsideration set aside.
Yeah.
On reconsideration.
Yeah.
Non-white was only 33%.
Yeah.
And then for reconsideration not granted, for whites, it was 54%. For non-whites, it was 46%. And I can give you the numbers too, as opposed to the percentages.
Yeah. Thank you, Ms. Basham. So I guess my initial reaction to that, and sorry if I am like stepping out of line here, but so there's a higher absolute number of of white applicants than at least African American, and I think this would add up to non-white in general. So in essence, the calculation that you're doing is taking this this row horizontally, right? This should add up to 100. This here should add up to 100%. It should be one divided by 1, right?
Minus the unknowns and the others.
Ignoring the unknowns and others, yes. It seems like it might be appropriate though to do let me do that, to do an appropriation, do a calculation down the column. That is to say, of this, let's just say 1,100 white set-asides, what percentage of the 2,300 is it versus the, call it 500 African-American set-asides? What percentage of, if you see what I mean? Like if you're a randomly selected African-American or white individual, what are your chances of having gotten a set-aside that year? As opposed to if you're randomly selecting somebody in the set-aside pool, what are your chances of that person being white or African-American? Does that make sense?
Well, kind of like in life, if you're white, your chances of a set-aside are much higher than if you're non-white.
Yeah.
Going back to the previous slide, another thing I think is interesting is if we think about non-whites represented 39% of the requests for reconsideration and 33% of the denials. So I don't know if we can literally do numbers to or like apples to apples in that regard, but that is 585 divided by 1491 times 100. No, that's not right.
Yep, that was another number I wished we had, Miss Basham, was.
You can call me whatever. You can call me by my nickname, Sam.
Such a hard time is of the folks that who doesn't ask for a set aside. That's what I'd like to know. Who are the folks not asking for a set aside? Because it's a pretty big number of people that just don't even apply for a set aside. And what is the racial breakdown of those individuals?
55% of non-whites do not request reconsideration in 2018.
Yep. So is that withdrawn number?
No. I was not. The numbers, what I'm reporting is not that. But
okay. Oh, for some reason I thought we didn't get that from them, but we did. Good. That was in the second set of data that we received from them, or no?
Ms. Evans, I believe we got that number reported fairly early on, but I'd have to go back and check to see which specific data set.
It's fine. You don't need to.
So basically looking at this one for 2019, I calculated too, and I came up with the same. So for the set-asides for white, about 67%. And then non-whites was 33%. For not set-asides, 54.2, well, 54% we'll say for white, and then 46% for non-white. Michelle, is that what you would come up with as well?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you want me to type this up and send this to you?
Will or Mr. Vogel?
Oh, sorry, I was blanking there. That would be helpful, Ms. Basham. I'm actually going to flash something on screen. I think it's appropriate. So I'm not quite doing the same calculation you are, but because I neglected to get rid of the none provided unknown other. But so this, for example, to set aside here. This, for example, would be I think what you were calculating. Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, it is. I think the only difference, like you mentioned, is that she removed the the none provided and the unknown other. So that's going to change the N. So it's going to readjust everything percentages wise. So
Okay, gotcha. But yeah, it would be helpful if you sent me what you had, but I guess what I'm saying is like, don't tear your hair out about it. I've also sort of got an equivalent thing going on this side. Yeah, and I guess, yeah.
I'm doing it right now.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
cool. So I think we probably want to do that for both 2018 and 2019. So we would have that for both. Again, I think, set aside and not set aside are our two biggest categories. It doesn't give us the full picture, but it gives us a good picture and allows us to do some explore by race, ethnicity. So anything else with this slide? Things that everyone would love to hear your thoughts when you see this. Are there things that are clicking, not clicking, things that we need to break down to just make it more digestible for others?
Is there any reason that we would get in the weeds specific for African American and Native American instead of putting them all together for set asides and even if nothing else, to do some comparison data with like Department of Corrections data?
I think there's stuff we could do with the African American data, but Native American, we've got way too many.
Well, if we're just talking about
the set asides and not set aside.
Yeah,
you're right. We do have.
I just always want to point out that our Native American population is so low, and looking at that data separately, I think sometimes is important for us to point out. And then you guys hear me talk about this all the time when we're talking about women specifically, when this field is so, the fields that we're talking about is so dominated by women, it might be good to, I could even do that.
Proportional to set asides.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and I suppose along those lines, I should point out, this is table 2, which represents all genders. We then go to tables 2A and 2B, which break these data down by male and female.
Is it all less than 10s on the female one?
Actually, let me check. And they use the term gender in this, so.
That's male.
That's male, sorry.
So not set aside 32, set aside 47. So it's at least whole numbers. Not set aside 30. Okay. And especially like one of the topics of conversation that we have been talking about at March is, right now, it's like, I think 4% of folks that are in clinical care, which is like mental health therapy and LADCs and stuff, are BIPOC. And when you're serving those folks, like how much more beneficial is it to have somebody that looks like you be the person that's doing your therapy? And so even more now, we need folks that are Black and brown bodied to be doing this work and serving culturally specific programs. And so I don't know how we would write that up, do some finding of fact, and then be able to talk about the high level of need. And then how this disproportionality is impacting impacting like us as an industry. Right, Roy?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It all goes together. So one of the things I'm sitting here wondering is, we talked earlier about trying to group these into favorable, adverse, and maybe neutral, and I'm left wondering if and I hate to go back to DHS again with more requests, because I know they're very busy, but I just partially wonder if we group these into the favorable, adverse, and neutral, if the numbers would be large enough that would allow us to have get rid of a lot of the less than 10s. And I don't know, and that's the nature of having these less than 10s. You don't know how far under 10 we are, but if we group them, categorize them, I just wonder if we couldn't do more with the data in that regard. Does that make sense? And do others think, is it worth it? Is it not worth it to go there? Or maybe I didn't explain it well.
What you said makes sense. It's just a matter of, do we want to do that, and ask them to do that.
Others' thoughts? Thank you, Mr. Sandoval.
I think we should ask them. And Will, I just sent you the data.
Thank you, Ms. Basham.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I can circulate that to the members if you'd like.
Circulate. Oh yes. What she said. Yes. Thank you. So members, would we be okay making a request to DHS to try to categorize these as favorable, adverse, or neutral, and see if that gives us, categories that we can work with then?
Can you tell us, I might have been writing the other data when you explained this, but what would neutral mean? Just so I know what we'd be asking for.
Yeah. Ms. Evans, would you explain the two categories that you thought were more neutral?
So limited set aside and not set aside variance granted. And so those, I just feel like, while people can stay employed, for the employer itself, for the employer and the person, like, yes, those are positive. They're just kind of harder to work with. And so, I mean, for what we're talking about, to get those numbers pulled together, though, that could, really just be, are people working or are people not? And we could leave it just the two categories for.
Yeah, and I think that might be the best, just because if we want to be able to do a little analysis and not have less than 10s, I think really having two categories is probably going to be the best way to go. So Mr. Vogel, do you feel comfortable articulating that to DHS?
Certainly, Mr. Chair. I can basically
or drafting something, and I can take a look.
Yeah, I'll draft something and send it over to you. I'd essentially be adapting that version of your question from the previous week, identifying withdrawn, correctness affirmed, and not set aside as unfavorable, ignoring in process, and the rest as favorable.
Yeah, so I think we'd almost be asking for a rerun of most of this data set, yep. collapsing those categories into, two categories. And then I think it would be, I think we could do a little more with it. So
yeah.
I think that's going to be dependent with, DHS going, oh, yes, that we agree with that interpretation of favorable and not adverse, or however we want to frame that, or maybe as Ms. Evans said, able to work, not able to work, that however or whatever language we want to use there. So
yeah, like, what is rescind in total?
Can you go back to the definition? Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
So I would take that as they can work. That's my
Yeah.
No,
interpretation.
it says their background study status is now eligible.
Mhm.
So that means that they can apply?
See, I understand is eligible to work. But again, this is where I don't do this every day. So this, this, I would rely
All right,
on interpretation of others.
incorrect. So that means their correctness, and what's the difference between correctness affirmed and rescind in total?
I think those are opposite because I think the correctness affirmed is they're saying that whatever was determined in the initial study, they've affirmed it, saying it was correct. And the assumption is they were disqualified, so they're still disqualified and they would be ineligible to work.
Got it. So
Rescind in
rescind in
total is that they go back and they look at that background study saying, oops, our determination was incorrect. So
Yeah.
we're rescinding it and then the person would be eligible to work.
Got it.
That's my take. So.
Yep, perfect.
Cool. So yeah, so I think essentially we're asking to have DHS collapse into two categories of eligible to work, not eligible to work, and break it down with the same the same other factors such as race, ethnicity, and gender, and that way we'll be able to go back and I think do some of these comparisons that might be much more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can definitely draft a version of that request and get it over to you for your approval, Mr. Chair.
Good. Well, I might propose that we're not quite at the top of the hour here, but I want to give us some time to wrap up here. Could I propose some homework in case we haven't done it before our next meeting, just to finish taking a look at data set 4 to see what's there, if you haven't, and read through the definitions. Mr. Vogel and I will work on putting in the updated request to DHS. I would anticipate that we would not have that before our next meeting, but we will get that request submitted. I would say that Mr. Vogel, you and I can communicate and see if time will permit for you to do some of the newly proposed tables tables and displays, I should say, in general, before our next meeting. And if we have time, then before our next meeting, we can get those out to the group and go through them as we did today, giving some feedback and such.
The other thing too, Roy, I just want to keep in mind for us is that the reason that we broke down the work for each of the other subcommittees was so that we, as data analysis, using that pretty loosely, could be doing work that helps them, right?
Right.
So it's great that we're going through data set 4, but this isn't really. So what are the next 2 chunks of stuff we're going over in remedies and disqualifications, and like how can the work, what we did today, I guess, was pretty helpful for disqualifications, but just so that we can be mindful of the work that we're doing and that it's lining up with the 3 meetings worth of work am I making sense?
You are. I think I'm going to be more attuned to that as I start attending the chairperson's meetings. So I will have to rely a little bit on you at this point in time, being dialed in.
Preponderance of evidence is what we're doing in remedies next for the next 3 meetings. So that'll be like 6 weeks. And then disqualifications, we're going to start meeting every week. And right now we are working on going through line by line, the disqualifying crimes and conduct, which is actually in data set 3. Okay. And so just we may want to have our next meeting be around data that it has to do with data set 3.
What would be the best way to orchestrate that, Ms. Evans? What do you have a recommendation? I'm totally hearing you and I'm agreeing.
Yep.
I am just in a
Yep. So what we're gonna do during our next disqualification meeting is basically just go line by line through the statute and look at what is it, how does it land, and like organize it. And so, I mean, we could even do that, like just go through, is it data set 3, Will?
I believe so, Ms. Evans.
Yeah, and so we could just do what we did today, pick the year, look at it, and like, what do we see? Look at what the stuff we've already come up with. Like, I feel like having Michelle here was gold. Thank you, Ben. And so, and having all of our eyes on it, and so.
Yeah, so let's shift then, because rethinking data set 4, I think maybe we put it on hold until we get our request into DHS and get some collapsed data back. So maybe we spend some time going back to data set 3 next time that we meet. Ms. Evans, would you are very, very attuned to what's going on in those other committees. If you
let's run it by John.
Yeah.
Because he's the lead in disqualifications, and just make sure that sounds right to him. But I just feel like if we're working in collaboration with the other subcommittees, and
I agree.
Yep, just see what he's got to say, because this was fabulous. And I have to hop on. We're doing an interview at 3, and I need a couple minutes to prep. Okay. So I think that would just be good to check with John and just see for next steps for us, if us lining up with disqualifications would be helpful. And then what do we want to do about POE? That's less data. And so I think we could run through that fairly quickly, and we have already done a lot of that work. So,
and just so I'm clear, are you willing to initiate that conversation with John?
Yep, or Will could as well start an email between the 3 of us and see if that's work he wants us to do next.
Perfect. So. Thank you. I before we wrap up, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone. I know we jumped into the weeds today. Calculators out or whatnot. I always have a calculator sitting next to me. It's what I do, but whether it be phone or calculator. But thank you, and I just encourage all of us. We need all of our minds looking from different angles and perspectives. So if we're ever going too far down the rabbit hole per se, ask so that we can step back, because it's not just about us understanding the data. It's about us, creating displays that are going to be helpful to the rest of the task force and to whoever is interested, whoever reads this. So we really need to just stop and ask sometimes, is this meaningful? Is this helpful? Is this valuable in some way? And does it make sense? So I just really, really appreciate all of you being here. I know it's a longer block of time, and it's a lot. So thank you. I will look forward to seeing all of you in 2 weeks. So our next meeting is, let's look at the date here, 2 weeks from today. So that would be June 2nd from 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock p.m. Any questions, any comments before we wrap up?
Thank you for leading the way and helping us get some movement going. You did a good job, Roy.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you to all of you for jumping in, and Michelle, welcome. So excited to have you here. So
thank you for your leadership, sir.
Agreed. Congratulations, Roy, on the chair nomination. I think I missed that part. Well chosen, group.
Thank you. Well, I actually got appointed. Chair Geffen decided to make an appointment, and I was fortunate
like a voluntold thing.
And happy to do it. Happy to do it.
8 months in, it was time to get a move on, Jolene. Time to get a move on. So.
Okay. Well, good, productive meeting. I look forward to doing this again in 2 weeks. I hope that you all are looking forward to it in some way, shape, or form as well. And we'll just keep on going through the data.